The emergency call came at 1:47 a.m. Water gushing through a mansion's master bedroom ceiling while 35-year-old Plumber Jake Torres gripped his toolbox with calloused hands soaked from the midnight rain. That's when he found her sitting on marble stairs in a silk nightgown, mascara streaking down porcelain cheeks, whispering, "I can't do this alone anymore." Jake blinked. Was this really about a broken pipe, or was this the moment two worlds collided in ways neither expected? The wrench slipped from his grip as he realized fixing her plumbing might be the easy part. Jake Torres had been answering emergency plumbing calls for 12 years, but the voice on the phone at 1:47 a.m. cut through his sleep like a blade, sharp with desperation and something else he couldn't name. "Please," she said, her words tumbling together. "You have to come to Magnolia Estate right now. There's water everywhere and I don't know what to do." Jake sat up in his narrow bed, squinting at the caller ID that showed only a number, no name. Magnolia Estate. He knew that address. Everyone in town did. The kind of place where the driveways were longer than most people's streets. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, already reaching for his work clothes. The rain hammered against his van's windshield as he drove through the wealthy district where houses sat behind iron gates like fortresses guarding their secrets. Each mansion he passed was worth more than he'd make in 10 lifetimes, maybe 20. His headlights swept across manicured lawns and circular driveways where luxury cars sat under covered porticos. Jake's van, with its peeling paint and rattling exhaust, felt like an intruder in this world of perfect hedges and motion sensor lights. His toolbox rattled in the back seat, the same worn leather case his father had carried to job sites before the construction accident that changed everything. Jake was 19 when he became the only provider for his younger sister Emma, learning to fix pipes and unclog drains while other kids his age were figuring out college majors. The weight of responsibility had shaped his hands and his heart in equal measure. The mansion's front door stood wide open when he arrived, water cascading down the marble steps like a waterfall that caught the glow of emergency lights flickering through tall windows. Jake grabbed his toolbox and stepped into the chaos, his boots squelching on what had once been an expensive Persian rug, now soaked and ruined beyond repair. The sound of rushing water echoed from somewhere upstairs, mixed with the steady drip of rain through broken gutters. He followed the sound up a grand staircase that belonged in a movie, his mind already calculating pipe pressure and water damage costs from the volume of water. He could hear this wasn't a small leak, this was a catastrophe, the kind that required shutting off main lines and calling in industrial pumps to prevent structural damage. The master bedroom ceiling had collapsed entirely, sending chunks of plaster and insulation floating in 3 inches of standing water that reflected the crystal chandelier's fractured light like a broken mirror. Jake had seen flood damage before, but never in a room that looked like it belonged in a palace. Antique furniture bobbed against silk curtains that hung in waterlogged tatters. That's when he saw her sitting on the grand staircase in a silk nightgown that clung to her shoulders, mascara streaking down her face like black tears. She looked up at him with eyes that held more than panic about water damage. There was something deeper, something that made Jake's chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen that look before in his own mirror after his father's funeral, when the world felt too big and he felt too small. "I can't do this alone anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of water rushing through broken pipes. Jake realized this emergency call was about to become something neither of them expected. The wrench slipped from his grip as he understood that fixing her broken pipe might be the simplest part of this midnight encounter. She sat there in the ruins of her bedroom like a ghost haunting her own life, while Jake stood in his work boots and flannel shirt, feeling the weight of more than just plumbing tools in his hands. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was a chasm of class and circumstance that seemed impossible to cross, yet here they were brought together by water and desperation at an hour when the rest of the world slept. Jake picked up his wrench and stepped into the flooded room, knowing that some repairs couldn't wait until morning. Jake waded through the flooded bedroom, his work boots sending ripples across the surface, while the woman watched him with hollow eyes that reflected the broken chandelier light. She sat perfectly still on the marble stairs, like she was afraid to move, afraid to make this disaster any worse than it already was. The water reached his ankles, cold and murky, mixed with plaster, dust and pieces of what used to be an expensive ceiling. The burst pipe had been spraying water for hours, turning the opulent space into a disaster zone where silk curtains hung like wet rags and antique furniture floated like debris from a shipwreck. Jake had seen flood damage before, but never in a bedroom that looked like it belonged in a museum. A 4-poster bed sat half submerged, its carved headboard dark with water stains, while oil paintings in golden frames dripped steadily onto the ruined hardwood floor. She explained between shaky breaths that she'd been alone in the house when it happened. The staff dismissed earlier that evening after her father's funeral reception. Her voice cracked on the word funeral, and Jake realized she was still wearing black underneath the silk nightgown, still processing grief when the ceiling decided to cave in on top of everything else. "My name is Sophia," she said quietly. "Sophia Whitmore," and Jake recognized the name from newspaper headlines and charity event announcements. Jake worked methodically, shutting off the main water line while Sophia sat on the stairs clutching a waterlogged photo of an older man in an expensive suit. The frame was silver and ornate, but the water had seeped behind the glass, blurring the image like tears. His practiced hands moved through the shutoff procedure, but his eyes kept drifting back to her, the way she held that photo like it was the only solid thing left in her world. The silence between them filled with the steady drip of water from the ruined ceiling and the distant hum of his industrial pump working to clear the flood. Jake had brought the pump in from his van, knowing from experience that standing water was the enemy of foundations and floor joists. The machine's steady rhythm was oddly comforting in the chaos, like a mechanical heartbeat keeping time while everything else fell apart. She told him about inheriting the estate at 28, only to discover her father had left behind more debts than assets and a family name that felt like a prison. The Whitmore legacy everyone expected her to carry forward was built on borrowed money and failed investments. She'd learned this morning from lawyers who spoke in careful voices about liquidation and bankruptcy. Her father had hidden the truth behind charity galas and country club memberships. Jake's calloused hands moved efficiently through the repair work, but his mind kept drifting to the way she flinched when he asked if anyone was coming to help her. "No one," she'd said too quickly, like she'd been asked that question before and learned to lie about the answer. Her shoulders tensed whenever he mentioned calling someone, family, friends, anyone who might care. That she was sitting in a flooded mansion at 2 in the morning. The pipe had burst because the heating system had been turned off to save money, she admitted, her voice barely audible over the sound of draining water. Jake paused in his work, understanding flooding. He'd never connected frozen pipes with poverty before, but here it was in a mansion where turning down the thermostat meant risking thousands in water damage because the bills were already too high to pay. As Jake installed the new pipe joint, he noticed how she watched his hands work with something that looked like envy, as if she wished she knew how to fix things herself. Her manicured fingers traced the silver frame of the photograph while his scarred knuckles twisted wrenches and fitted joints. She studied every movement like she was memorizing a skill she'd never been taught in her expensive education. When the water finally stopped flowing, Jake realized they'd both been holding their breath, waiting for something more than just plumbing to be repaired. The sudden silence felt heavy with possibility and loss mixed together, like the water that had ruined everything beautiful in this room. Sophia looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she wasn't crying anymore. Sophia led Jake downstairs to the kitchen, where she made coffee with shaking hands in a space that looked like it belonged in a magazine but felt cold as a mausoleum. The countertops were marble, the appliances were stainless steel and gleaming, but there was no warmth in the perfection, no signs of life beyond the careful arrangement of expensive objects that nobody touched. She moved through the motions of making coffee like she was performing a ritual she'd learned but never truly understood. She explained that everyone expected her to maintain the Whitmore legacy, the charity galas, the social connections, the perfect image, while the bills piled up like snow. Her voice carried the weight of 28 years of preparation for a role she never wanted to play. The junior league expected her at their meetings, the hospital board counted on her family's annual donation, and the country club still sent invitations addressed to Miss Sophia Whitmore, as if the title came with a trust fund that could cover the mounting expenses. Jake sat at the marble island sipping coffee from a cup that probably cost more than his weekly grocery budget while she paced barefoot on the polished floor. Her silk nightgown had dried but still clung to her frame, making her look fragile in the enormous space. The kitchen could have fed 50 people, but Jake noticed there were only 2 coffee cups in the cabinet and a refrigerator that hummed empty except for takeout containers and a bottle of wine. The weight of her father's expectations pressed down on her shoulders. She said he'd groomed her to be the perfect society daughter but never taught her how to actually manage money or make real decisions. Charles Whitmore had controlled every aspect of her education, her social calendar, even her friendships, but he'd never sat her down to explain profit and loss or how to read a financial statement. She knew which fork to use at formal dinners, but not how to balance a checkbook. Jake watched her move through the enormous kitchen like a ghost haunting her own life, opening cabinets that were mostly empty despite their expensive facades. The pantry held a few cans of soup and a box of crackers that looked like they'd been there for months. She pulled out drawers filled with silver serving pieces that hadn't been used since her father's funeral reception, when the house had been full of people who'd disappeared as quickly as they'd come. She confessed that she'd been living on credit cards and the kindness of caterers who still believed the Whitmore name meant guaranteed payment. The florist still delivered arrangements for events she couldn't afford to host. The dry cleaner still pressed her father's suits hanging in closets while she wore the same 3 outfits over and over, trying to maintain appearances on a budget that existed only in people's assumptions about her wealth. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that he, a working-class plumber, was sitting in a mansion drinking coffee with someone who couldn't afford to keep her heat on. He'd driven through neighborhoods like this his whole life, assuming the people behind these gates never worried about money, never lay awake at night calculating bills and wondering how to make ends meet. Yet here was Sophia pacing across marble floors while her bank account dwindled toward zero. Sophia stopped pacing and looked directly at him, asking what it felt like to know exactly what you were worth, to know that your work had real value in the world. Her question hit him like cold water because he'd never thought of his worth that way. He'd always measured himself against what he couldn't afford, the college education he'd never gotten, the vacations he couldn't take with Emma. But Sophia was asking about something different. Jake set down his coffee cup and told her about learning his trade from his father, about the satisfaction of fixing something that was broken and having it stay fixed. He explained how every successful repair built his confidence, how every satisfied customer proved his value in concrete terms. When he fixed a pipe, it worked. When he installed a water heater, families had hot showers for years. His hands created solutions that lasted. For the first time since he'd arrived, Sophia smiled a real smile, and Jake felt something shift between them, like a pipe finally releasing its pressure. She'd spent her life being told she was valuable because of her name, her inheritance, her social position, but she'd never experienced the satisfaction of solving a problem with her own hands. Jake found himself returning to the Whitmore estate the next evening, not for another emergency, but because Sophia had called that afternoon, her voice different than it had been at midnight, steadier but still uncertain. She'd asked if he could teach her basic home maintenance, and something in the way she said it made him realize this wasn't about fixing pipes anymore. This was about fixing herself. She met him at the door wearing jeans and an old sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking more real than she had in her silk nightgown. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by something that looked like it came from a regular store, maybe even secondhand. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, and Jake could see freckles across her nose that expensive foundation had hidden. The transformation was so complete he almost didn't recognize her. They walked through the mansion together as Jake pointed out signs of neglect: the loose floorboards that creaked under their weight, the dripping faucets that had been ignored for months, the electrical outlets that sparked when touched. His trained eye caught problems that had been building for years. While the Whitmores focused on appearances instead of maintenance, the crown molding was perfect, but the pipes were ancient, the marble floors gleamed, but the water pressure was failing. Sophia took notes in a leather journal, writing down everything he said about pipe maintenance and water pressure with the focus of someone studying for finals. She asked him to repeat things twice to make sure she understood the difference between a pipe wrench and a basin wrench. Her handwriting was neat and careful, like she was documenting something important. Her pen moved across the page, recording details about shut-off valves and water pressure that her expensive education had never covered. Jake showed her how to shut off the main water line, how to check for leaks, and how to use a plunger properly, while she laughed at her own clumsy attempts. Her first try with the plunger sent water splashing across the bathroom floor, and she jumped back startled, then laughed harder than Jake had heard since he'd met her. The sound echoed through the empty halls of the mansion, filling spaces that had been silent too long. She admitted that she'd never been allowed to do anything practical growing up, that her father had hired people for everything while she learned piano and French. Her childhood had been spent in lessons that taught her to speak beautifully and play music perfectly, but never to solve problems with her hands. Charles Whitmore had believed that manual work was beneath his daughter, that her value lay in her ability to charm donors at charity events, not in her ability to fix what was broken. As they worked side by side replacing washers in the guest bathroom faucets, Jake noticed how her hands, though soft, were steady and determined. She held the tools carefully like they were precious things, learning to position her fingers correctly around the wrench handle. Her movements were tentative at first but grew more confident as she understood the mechanics of what they were doing. Jake found himself talking more than he had in months, telling her about the satisfaction of solving problems with his hands, about the dignity he found in honest work. He explained how every successful repair built something inside him, how fixing things that were broken made him feel like he was putting his own life back together, one pipe at a time. The physical work had been his therapy after his parents died, giving him purpose when everything else felt meaningless. Sophia asked him about his life, about raising his sister Emma alone after their parents died, and how he'd built his plumbing business from nothing. Jake talked about the early days when he'd worked double shifts to pay for Emma's school supplies, about the pride he felt when customers called him back for bigger jobs because they trusted his work. His voice carried the weight of years spent proving himself, one repair at a time. When they finished the repairs, Sophia looked around the bathroom with pride, as if she'd built the entire house herself, her eyes bright with something Jake recognized as accomplishment, the same feeling he got when he solved a particularly difficult plumbing problem. She'd never felt useful before, never experienced the satisfaction that came from creating something with her own hands. 3 weeks later, Jake was installing new pipes in the mansion's outdated plumbing system while Sophia worked beside him, handing him tools and learning the names of each fitting. Her fingers had grown steadier with practice, no longer fumbling when he asked for a pipe wrench or coupling. She repeated the names under her breath like she was memorizing a foreign language, which in a way she was the language of practical work that her father had never taught her. She'd started paying him not with money she didn't have, but with home-cooked meals and stories about her father's business empire that was crumbling faster than the mansion's foundation. The sandwiches she made were simple but good, her hands still learning how to prepare food that came from ingredients instead of takeout containers. She told him about the real estate deals that had gone bad, the investments that had failed while her father kept up appearances at the country club, pretending the Whitmore fortune was still intact. Jake learned that beneath her polished exterior, Sophia was sharp and funny, with a mind that grasped complex problems quickly once someone bothered to explain them. She understood water pressure calculations after he showed her twice, and could identify different pipe materials by feel alone. Her questions weren't the careful, polite inquiries of someone making conversation, they were the direct, focused questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand how things worked. They developed a rhythm, working together, her anticipating what tool he needed next while he patiently answered her endless questions about water pressure and pipe materials. She learned to read his movements, the way he positioned his body before reaching for a specific wrench, or how he tilted his head when he was listening to sounds inside the walls that told him where problems were hiding. Their conversations flowed between technical explanations and personal stories, creating a comfort Jake hadn't expected. During lunch breaks, they sat on the mansion's back steps sharing sandwiches while Sophia talked about her dreams of turning the estate into something meaningful instead of just a monument to wealth. She wanted to create a place where people could come to learn practical skills, where working-class families could access resources that had always been reserved for the wealthy. Her eyes lit up when she described teaching centers and community workshops that could fill the empty rooms with purpose. Jake told her about his sister Emma's college plans and how he'd been saving every extra dollar to make sure she could become the teacher she wanted to be. Emma was smart, smarter than anyone in their family had ever been, and Jake had worked double shifts for years to keep her dreams alive. The scholarship money would help, but it wouldn't cover everything, and Jake refused to let his sister graduate with the kind of debt that would crush her before she even started teaching. Sophia listened with an intensity that made Jake realize no one had ever really talked to her about dreams that didn't involve marriage or social status. She asked questions about Emma's favorite subjects, about what kind of classroom she wanted to have, about the students she hoped to inspire. Her focus was complete, like she was studying something precious that she'd never seen before. The idea that someone could work toward a goal simply because they loved it. One afternoon, while they were replacing corroded pipes in the basement, Sophia asked Jake if he thought she was strong enough to rebuild her life from scratch. The question came out of nowhere while they were both bent over a particularly stubborn joint, her voice barely audible over the sound of their work. But Jake heard the fear underneath the words, the same fear he'd felt when his parents died and he'd realized he was responsible for Emma's future. Jake looked at her dirt-streaked face and calloused palms and told her that anyone who could learn plumbing in 3 weeks could probably learn anything. Her hands had changed over the past month, developing small cuts and calluses that she wore like badges of honor. The softness was still there, but it was backed by something stronger now, something that came from knowing she could fix things that were broken. That evening, as they cleaned up their tools, Sophia reached for Jake's hand, and for the first time since the midnight emergency call, they both stopped pretending this was just about plumbing. Her palm was rough against his, and he realized that somewhere between the flooded bedroom and the basement repairs, they'd built something neither of them had been looking for. Jake arrived at the mansion one morning to find Sophia in the kitchen, surrounded by financial documents spread across the marble countertop like fallen leaves, her face pale as winter as she calculated numbers that kept getting worse with each page she turned. The expensive calculator beside her elbow showed figures that made her hands shake while she double-checked math that wouldn't change no matter how many times she ran the numbers. Her father's leather briefcase sat open, revealing folders thick with loan agreements and investment statements that painted a picture she'd never seen before. She discovered that the Whitmore fortune was built on borrowed money and failed investments that had been hidden behind charity galas and country club memberships. For years her father had mortgaged everything twice over, betting on real estate deals that collapsed and stock portfolios that never recovered from market crashes. She held up a document with shaking fingers showing Jake how Charles Whitmore had used the mansion as collateral for loans that were now coming due with interest rates that made her stomach turn. The estate would have to be sold, she told Jake, her voice steady despite the tears pooling in her eyes, but she'd finally learned something valuable about what really mattered. The lawyers had given her 60 days to find a buyer or face foreclosure proceedings that would strip away everything her family had built over 3 generations. Yet somehow, sitting there surrounded by the evidence of her father's deception, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Jake sat beside her at the kitchen table, looking at the numbers that represented the collapse of everything she'd been raised to believe was permanent. The mortgage payments alone exceeded what most families made in a year, and the credit card debt stretched across pages of statements showing purchases for appearances that had never brought happiness. The foundation of the Whitmore legacy was as cracked as the pipes they'd been repairing together. Sophia explained that losing the mansion felt like freedom instead of failure because she'd finally learned the difference between having money and having worth. She talked about the relief of not having to pretend anymore, of not needing to maintain an image that had always felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit her size. The weight of expectations that had pressed down on her shoulders for 28 years was lifting with each document she signed. She'd been offered a job managing a non-profit housing organization, work that would use her organizational skills to help people instead of just maintaining appearances. The salary was a fraction of what she'd spent on dresses for charity events, but the work had meaning that money couldn't buy. She would coordinate services for families in crisis using the same skills her father had taught her for managing social calendars, except now those skills would keep children housed instead of impressing donors. Jake realized that watching Sophia discover her own strength had changed him too, that he'd been hiding behind his working-class identity instead of recognizing his own value. He'd spent years thinking that worth came from how much money you made or didn't make, but seeing Sophia find purpose in practical work made him understand that his skills had value beyond the hourly rate he charged. His hands created solutions that lasted and that mattered more than any social status. They spent the afternoon planning how to finish the mansion's plumbing repairs before the sale, making sure the next owners would have a solid foundation to build on. Sophia insisted on learning every step of the process so she could explain the work to potential buyers. Her attention to detail was fierce, like she was determined to leave something perfect behind even as everything else crumbled around her. As they worked together on the final pipe connections, Sophia told Jake that he'd taught her more about life in a month than her expensive education had in 20 years. She'd learned that satisfaction came from solving problems, not avoiding them, that strength came from using your hands to fix what was broken instead of paying someone else to make problems disappear. That night, as they stood in the repaired master bedroom where they'd first met, Jake understood that some things broken by water damage could be fixed, but others had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The room looked different now, clean and dry, but forever changed by what had happened there, just like both of them. 6 months later, Jake was installing the plumbing in a small apartment complex that provided transitional housing for families in crisis. With Sophia as the project manager, her hard hat sat crooked on her head while she checked measurements on blueprints that were already smudged with dirt and coffee stains. The morning sun caught the dust motes floating through the construction site as Jake fitted copper pipes into walls that would soon hold the hopes of families starting over. She'd sold the mansion and used the proceeds to pay off her father's debts and fund the housing project that would give people a chance to rebuild their lives. The sale had taken 3 months to finalize, with lawyers and bankers picking apart every detail of the Whitmore estate, but when the papers were signed, Sophia walked away with enough money to clear Charles Whitmore's name and start something that mattered. The transition from heiress to housing advocate had happened faster than anyone expected, including herself. Jake watched her coordinate with contractors and social workers, wearing work boots and carrying a clipboard with the same confidence she'd once worn silk gowns. Her voice carried across the construction site as she discussed timelines with electricians and deadlines with painters. The same organizational skills that had managed charity galas now managed construction schedules and housing applications. Her father's training in perfection had found its purpose in creating homes for people who needed the most. They worked together every day now, not as plumber and client but as partners in something that mattered more than either of them had imagined possible. Jake handled the technical aspects while Sophia managed the human side of the project, coordinating with social services and screening families who would live in these apartments. Their conversations flowed between pipe specifications and family interviews, creating a rhythm that felt natural after months of learning to work together. Sophia had kept only one thing from the mansion: the waterlogged photo of her father that she'd been holding the night they met, now restored and framed in her small office. The picture sat on a metal desk next to housing applications and contractor invoices. Charles Whitmore's face looked out from behind new glass while his daughter used the skills he'd taught her to help people he'd never bothered to notice. The photo reminded her where she'd come from, without defining where she was going. Jake's sister Emma had started volunteering at the housing complex, teaching children while their parents attended job training programs that Sophia had organized. Emma's education degree was still 2 semesters away, but she had a natural way with kids that made them feel safe in temporary spaces that could feel scary. The sound of children's laughter echoed through unfinished hallways, mixing with the noise of construction tools and adult conversations about fresh starts. The first families moved into the completed apartments on a rainy Tuesday morning, and Jake felt the same satisfaction he'd always found in fixing things that were broken, but this time the repair work extended beyond pipes and walls to include lives that had been damaged by circumstances beyond anyone's control. He watched movers carry furniture upstairs he'd helped build into rooms where families would sleep safely for the first time in months. Sophia stood beside him, watching a single mother unlock her new front door while her children ran through rooms that smelled like fresh paint and possibility. The woman's hands shook as she turned the key, but her smile was steady as her kids claimed bedrooms and explored a kitchen that belonged to them. The apartment wasn't large, but it was theirs for as long as they needed to get back on their feet. That evening, as they cleaned up their tools, Jake realized that the midnight emergency call had led them both to discover what they'd been searching for without knowing it. The flooded bedroom had been the beginning of something neither of them could have planned. The broken pipe had broken more than just plaster and expensive furniture. It had broken the barriers between their worlds. They'd learned that true worth wasn't measured in dollars or social status, but in the ability to use your skills to make someone else's life a little bit better. Jake's plumbing expertise and Sophia's organizational abilities had combined to create something that would outlast both of them. Families would live in these apartments for years to come, each one getting the chance to rebuild that everyone deserved. Sometimes the most important repairs happen not to pipes or walls but to the assumptions we make about ourselves and others based on class and circumstance. Jake had always believed his worth came from his hourly wage, while Sophia had been taught hers came from her family name, but the midnight emergency call stripped away those false measurements, revealing something deeper underneath. Jake and Sophia discovered that genuine human connection transcends social boundaries when we're willing to see past surface appearances to the person underneath. Their story reminds us that crisis moments often reveal not just what's broken but what's possible when we approach each other with curiosity instead of judgment.